Qian for Imperial Palace Secretary pay. In the second month, yellow orioles fly in the imperial gardens. Spring mornings in the courtyard, still dark before sunrise. The sound of bells from the Changle Palace fades beyond the flowers. Weeping willows by Dragon Pool glisten from the rain. The sun cannot warm the cold sadness of my failed career. Looking up at stars through the clouds, I still wish I could serve. 10 years of my petitions have met with no response. When I glimpse your official hairpin, I'm ashamed of my thin white hair. Okay, so we continue now with another poet. Qian is not a stranger to this anthology. He is not one of the well-represented poets, but he has 3 poems at least in this anthology, 2 of which we've already encountered and commented, including one I remember of, I think it was saying farewell to a Buddhist monk who was going to Japan. So 3 poems, so he's on the lower range of poets in the collection. We gave some biographical information about him when we talked about the previous 2 poems, but just to make a very quick summary, Qian he is a between High Tang and Middle Tang poet. He's one of the group known as the Dali era poets, so he basically lived in the main part in the 8th century. He had a pretty long life. He started to occupy positions of office just about the time of the An Lushan Rebellion, probably a little bit later. And he mostly had a career of middling posts in the periphery and in the central administration, never rising to any really, really high posting or position. Chang Chi was from the east of the country, southeast, I think from the old region of Wu. And when he got to the capital, he did manage to make a friendship with a very old and aging Wang Wei. And in fact, some people saw him as a continuator or as a follower in Wang Wei's footsteps. A little bit later on, he also met with Lu Lun, with whom he became a good friend. We've already talked about Lu Lun. Lu Lun is the most famous of the Dali era poets. So Chang is a poet that's mainly to be seen as in his highest productive period in the 760s, 770s, during the reign of Emperor Dezong. And well, the Dali era poets weren't very highly valued later by the tradition. They were considered like manieristic poems, following the styles with little originality that had been plodded through and taken to the highest peaks during the High Tang period. But they were appreciated, at least in their own time period, and later as at least efficient craftsmen. Okay, so let's focus on this poem. This poem seems to be a very typical poem in the tradition that we have read of heptasyllabic poems. It reminds me those 2 or 3 poems that we read about morning audiences at the imperial court, and the topic is quite similar. So, main topic, the scholar's complaint. Qian is complaining that he hasn't been in office, or at least in high office, for at least a decade, and that he's growing old. So this, a very common Du Fu theme. It feels less sincere in Qian though, who, as far as I know, did not have any big periods of banishment or anything. But he might have spent relatively big periods away from the imperial capital. Along with this topic, there is a descriptive element, especially in the first part of the poem, of describing the imperial court in early spring. This poem is sent or is written for a palace secretary who would probably have been a friend or an acquaintance of Qian. So it's a piece of flattery towards Secretary Pei, in that the main message of the poem is, oh, how I wish I could be in this spring serving in the court like you are, but I'm just getting old and useless, and while you are serving in this gilded world of the court. You could say the poet is the poem, is pretty distinctly divided into two parts, because the first two couplets focus on a description of a morning in the imperial palace in early spring. No, not early, the second month, so mid-spring. Whereas the last two couplets focus on the poetic persona, Qian lamenting his being out of office and his growing old. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. In the second month, yellow orioles fly in the imperial gardens. Spring mornings in the courtyard, still dark before sunrise. So the first couplet, as usually happens, locates us in time and in space. The time is, from the fact that from the very first words, the second month, which in the Chinese lunisolar calendar would have landed approximately around April. So full-fledged spring. And spring morning is mentioned in the second couplet. But we also get the time of day. More specifically, it's still dark before sunrise. So it's not only morning, and it's not only the second month of spring, it's just before dawn. So very early in the morning. And we get the place as well, the imperial gardens and a courtyard, which is probably one of the courtyards before either the gates to the imperial palace, or inside the courtyards in front of the major basilicas, where scholar officials who were serving as bureaucrats went in for the morning audience with the emperor. We've read poems like this, as I said before, like the poems about morning audiences in the Daming Palace were like this. And we already explained there that scholar officials would have to get out of bed well before dawn. In darkness, they would have to ride or be transported to the gates of the imperial palace. There they would be, body checked and passed through the gates by the bodyguards and the armed garrison inside the imperial palace. They would be subjected to a roaster, and then they would enter for not really an audience, a bowing in front of the emperor, and then going to their respective offices in the chancellery or in the secretariat or in any of the ministries. So what we get here in this first couplet is an intimation of that scene in early morning when scholar officials are waiting to enter into the audience or waiting to enter into the palace at dawn. And it's cold, it's spring, it's the second month. We have some birds flying in the gardens. Orioles appear a lot in Chinese poetry, and I imagine they're here a symbol or a natural correlate to the scholar officials themselves, who are shaking their wings to reach the imperial palace and who are, also in the imperial precinct, in the courtyard, probably waiting in the darkness. Second couplet. So the second couplet describes more specifically, so this is what usually happens, there is a zoom in most of these classical Chinese poems. So the second couplet is a little bit more specific, and it describes us a sound and a sight of spring within the imperial palace. The sound of bells from the Changle Palace fades beyond the flowers. Weeping willows by Dragon Pool glisten from the rain. So the first line shows us an oral element, something that is heard, which is the sound of bells coming from the palace. And, it seems to echo and to fade beyond the background, the visual background of the flowers, the flower trees, the flower beds that might be in the imperial palace. And the second image is a visual one. Weeping willows by Dragon Pool glisten from the rain. So it's spring, it has probably been raining. The intense green leaves of the willows, shine with that lustre, jewel-like lustre that rain or dew imparts on intensely green material that feels like a jewel. And also you have the waters of the pool probably reflecting and shining. The names of places, this is a very typical Tang custom, also from before the Tang, which is using anachronistic names to refer to contemporary events or parts of the palace. So, for example, the bells are coming from the Changle Palace. As far as I know, the Changle Palace was one of the two big imperial palaces in Chang'an, not during the Tang, but during the Han Dynasty. That is to say, more than 500, even more than that, almost a millennium before the time of the Tang Dynasty. So Changle Palace is being used as a fancy, old-fashioned name for the buildings of the imperial palace itself. Dragon pool, this is a bit more generic. I imagine in all imperial palaces there were dragon pools. Chinese believed that dragons lived in pools. They were a sort of rain creature that rose with the storms. I imagine there would have been different pools in the precincts of the imperial palace. The most famous we talked about it was Phoenix Pool, but there would have been different dragon pools, probably in some of the courtyards or near some of the courtyards of the imperial palace. So we get this, the sound of bells echoing below behind the flowers, the glistening green leaves on the willows next to the lake. And again, a little reference to spaces inside the imperial palace, to hammer in the idea that we're there. Third couplet. So the first couplet takes us out of the imperial palace and into Qianqi's humble abode, we may presume, at least into his head. The sun cannot warm the cold sadness of my failed career. Looking up at stars through the clouds, I still wish I could serve. So at the same time, so this is early dawn, it's still dark, it's still cold, sunrise hasn't taken place yet, so you can still see the night sky, the heavens studded with stars. And Qianqi is reflecting. He's probably imagining the first scene, reminiscing the times at which he served of the palace, or thinking about his friend, Secretary Pei, entering the palace at that early morning hour. And, he's talking metaphorically here when he says, the sun cannot warm the cold sadness of my failed career. The sun hasn't risen yet, but even if it did, it cannot warm him. It's spring. The sun should have some power of warmth bigger than it had in winter. But it's useless for Qianqi because the sun that should warm him is the sun of imperial favor, and he has lacked that. He specifically mentions a failed career. He's been a bit hyperbolic, but, he is playing for pathos. Yeah. So he's a failure. Imperial sunshine has not graced him. The second line of the couplet also emphasizes this. He's looking up at the stars through the clouds and wishes that he could serve. It's not accidental that he's looking up at the sky, heaven, the constellations, at least some of the constellations, generally act as a symbol for the imperial palace and serving in the palace. So looking at the starry realm of heaven, as far away from him as the imperial court might be at that moment, and looking at the constellation that is surrounding the polar star, which is considered the abode of the emperor, he sighs in that he is not serving in the heavenly world of the court. Finally, the conclusion wraps the poem up as usual. It gives a little bit more detail about the supposedly failed career of Qianqi, and also about the reason for his pessimism, which is not only that his career has not been successful until now, but he clinches it with the idea that he's too old now, so he has no hope for the situation to change in the future. 10 years of my petitions have met with no response. When I glimpse your official hairpin, I'm ashamed of my thin white hair. So the poem ends on this sad, slightly over the top, I believe, flattering infra-depiction of Qianqi as a failure, as an old, wasted man who can no longer serve in office and who looks with envy at his friend, Imperial Palace Secretary Pei, who is wearing his cap of office and the pin tying his hair, because, officials at court had to wear a certain type of clothing and also have the hair in a band with a pin holding it together. So altogether quite a conventional poem on a very conventional topic, but it's not a bad piece of craftsmanship.